Okay. Now, I like to create notes like this for some reason. If it's irritating to you, I'm sorry. Okay, but you don't have to write all this stuff down. It's going to be online for you. Okay, don't worry about writing anything down unless you just like it. All right. Now, the first Americans, as we understand it, began to arrive into North America no less than about 12,000 years ago. No less than 12,000 years ago. Did they arrive earlier? More than likely. Right? Probably about 14,000 years ago. There's a lot of evidence for stuff like that, including things like Clovis and Folsom points. These are spear points that are found mostly in the southwest, and archaeologists classify these based on their shape and their quality of manufacture. Okay, their quality of sort of usefulness, and the assumption is that the more useful ones, the higher quality ones are later. So the oldest one is the Clovis tradition that goes back about 13,500 years ago from today, BP, before present. So we know that native peoples have been here for 14,000 years ago, 14,000 years, but they may have been here a lot longer. And the reason I started talking about underwater archaeology is because there was a problem. If we understand that American Indian people were migratory hunters, big game hunters, coming out of the Ice Age, assuming the last Ice Age, okay, then they were following supposedly these large game animals, many game animals that are no longer living, that are extinct, and they actually have names for it. The Pleistocene megafauna, the archaic bison. Anybody ever been down to the Sam Noble Museum of Natural History in Oklahoma City, or Norman? Fantastic place. There is the skull of the oldest known artwork in North America is on display down in Norman, and it came from Oklahoma. Did you know that? The oldest artwork in North America, known to exist in North America, is imagine me as buffalo, is a zigzag painted line on the forehead of a buffalo skull. Except it's not quite a buffalo skull, it's an archaic bison skull. An archaic bison was a lot bigger than a modern day American bison, buffalo. A lot bigger, and you know how bison have horns that kind of go like that? Like kind of like a short horn, cow. It had long horns. Okay, it had really long horns, and they were huge. Anyway, those huge megafauna were apparently what attracted native hunters from Siberia over into North America. There was no agriculture, we're pretty sure. If there was agriculture, they were somehow growing things in ice, okay, in tundra. Probably weren't doing that. Now, the problem is, we're not really sure exactly where they came across. We know that they came across the Bering Land Bridge, an area that we refer to as Beringia, right? How were they able to do that? Because it's covered with water now.
Because the sea level was less, because the moisture from the sea was now ice.
Okay, that's what I was trying for. And that is that the ocean levels were lower because of continental glaciation. The northern half of North America and the northern half of Eurasia, okay, were covered with mile or more thick ice, much like Antarctica and Greenland and most of Iceland are today. That huge amount of freshwater ice on top of the continents not only reduced the sea level, but it also did a number on the geology. It compressed the crust. And it's still springing upward, because it was only 14,000 years ago, or 12,000 years ago when it disappeared. That's isostasy. You can remember that in the geology class you take. Okay? So the idea here is that the ocean levels were reduced, therefore it exposed shallow seas, which are in the Bering Sea is real shallow areas, real good fishing ground. So Beringia was exposed. It was land. It was not an ice bridge. It was exposed land over which caribou and prehistoric land herding mammals were definitely migrating between Asia and North America. Okay, so people were just following those herds and eventually made it over here around 14,000. Now, if they came earlier, the problem is we don't have any evidence. Okay, they could most certainly have gotten here in the previous ice age. The previous ice age, which was around 35,000 years ago. Okay, there was an ice age before the last ice age. Same thing would have happened. So it's very possible native peoples could have gotten here earlier. Now, the nice thing is that today we have RNA and DNA, genome mapping, and that sort of thing, and most of our assumptions about timing seem to be pretty right on. Native peoples more than likely arrived in 3 different waves over the course of the last 9 to 14,000 years ago. Okay, so genetic evidence has sort of confirmed a lot of the things the archaeologists said. However, you have to remember that a lot of the areas that people may have migrated were along the coast, which are now inundated by the ocean. So there's probably tons of evidence that we'll never know about because it's gone, it's wiped out. All right, so you'll hear about the term the ice-free corridor. This was the area that was in between the Rocky Mountains, what we refer to as the Western Cordillera of North America, and the big, massive ice sheet. So there was the idea is that there was an ice-free corridor that herd animals were following down into the warmer parts of the continent during the Ice Age, and that's pretty much what happened is they followed those and eventually colonized all the way down to Tierra del Fuego and the tip of South America. That's the idea of coastal drift is this idea that it's very easy for people to follow coastlines when they migrate. Now there are people in the world, there are native peoples in the world who migrated a lot earlier than 14,000, 15,000 years ago. If you go to Australia, native Australians, Aboriginal Australians, arrived something like 50 to 60,000 years ago. And they migrated in that second to last ice age and have been in Australia for over 50,000 years. So they've experienced massive changes in Australia's climate and environment. Actually, they caused a lot of changes in the environment of Australia. Okay, you know about that? What's the wild dog in Australia? The dingo. Okay, dingoes were domesticated dogs that were brought by the Australian Aboriginals and went feral. So they're basically a feral version of dog. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Now, let's go back to native North America. So the native peoples arrive, they colonize in a very rapid, very short amount of time, only probably around 1,000 years to get from the Arctic down to the tip of South America. And then, of course, population would grow and cultures would differentiate and languages would change. So just going back to the Pleistocene a little bit here, one of the interesting facets of doing archaeology or geoarchaeology in the Pleistocene in the previous Ice Age period is that when the Indians showed up, a lot of things disappeared. Mammoth, mastodon, camel, giant, ground sloth, all of these things. In the past we've always said, oh well, it's climate change, changing environments, but animals can adapt unless they don't have any fear of humans, and the humans are hungry, right? So one of there's a hypothesis known as the Pleistocene overkill hypothesis that says that a lot of those bigger, slower things like giant ground sloths were easy pickings and may have been wiped out by early human populations. Which brings us to the Romantic savage thing again. Remember the idea of American Indians as and this is, I can think back to my childhood. It was a myth that was encouraged strongly all the time that American Indian people, and maybe it was because I was in Oklahoma, I don't know. American Indian people were the world's best ecologists and environmentalists and conservationists and lovers of nature and friends of the environment. This was something that was pushed when I was a kid, and you know, you see it develop, and it's even in the movies. You know, there's a whole class on that idea, on that concept. All right, but the fact of the matter is, Native peoples, whatever their language, whatever their culture, were people, and people often exploit their environment. All right. Yeah, sure, they may have had good reasons to preserve game animals, and they may have developed mythologies and religious traditions and patterns of culture that worked to respect nature, as most animistic groups do. But it's inaccurate to say that American Indians had adapted to the natural environment of North America, and when the Europeans arrived, everything was pristine, and it was an Eden with Native peoples enjoying life and living in harmony with nature. Okay? Don't buy that one. Native peoples raided each other. They committed warfare against one another. They challenged each other's territories. Who knows what happened? But more than likely, we know that Native peoples were like people everywhere. They didn't necessarily live in harmony with their environment, and that's one of the things that has attracted scholars into the subject of early historical geography. Is, you know, idea that the native peoples changed the environment of North America. We have to start there. You know, if we're going to talk about the historical geography of North America, we have to recognize that the American Indians, the Siberians removed from Siberia, changed the natural environment of the continent. Sure, they didn't build aqueducts, and they didn't have massive areas of agriculture, except in a few spots, okay? But they did transform the natural environment to their own liking and to their own needs. That's something that we need to realize and accept. And they did it maybe at a scale that might surprise us. Okay? Let me just skip down through here. I've talked already a little bit about domestication and that sort of thing. You know, some domestication may have been around as early as 2000 BC. Some of these things. Sunflower is actually a domesticated oil seed that was used by a lot of the southeastern native peoples, the Muskogean groups. So if you're Creek, or you have some Creek lineage or some Cherokee lineage, or Choctaw or Chickasaw or Miccosukee or something, then your ancestors were probably using sunflower, and a sunflower that had been improved a little bit over the generations so that it had more oil seed. So it's a good source of protein and fat, and good fat. So other things, there's a lot of other evidence of things. One of the more controversial items that popped up, a decade and a half or so ago, two decades, I guess, is the Kennewick Man. Anybody ever heard of that? Kennewick? In western Washington or central Washington state. Okay, it was on the idea was that there was a skeleton found. Actually, I think some people were water skiing or something, and they ran across this skull. And anyway, the archaeologists saw it and said, this particular individual doesn't fit the physiological expectations of native peoples in this area. And they dated his I guess it was probably radiocarbon dating of the bones to something like 7,300, 7,600 BC, or around almost 10,000 years ago. Right? So that was the finding. Now there was a lot of political maneuvering that took place during that time. We don't need to get into that, but Kennewick Man, I think, was later decided, that this wasn't necessarily a North European. A lot of people jumped up and said, "Hey, it's the Vikings showing up. Okay, they're here really early, 10,000 years ago, not just 1,000 years ago." But anyway, that's not really so important because we need to get back to the point of native peoples affecting the natural landscape. And so I have this slide, which you can look at later. You don't need to copy it or anything. And there's something called the pristine myth, which is why I was telling you, don't buy into the pristine myth. It's a popular perception in North America that before 1492, the continent was densely forested. It was virgin land. There was abundant wildlife. Well, there was abundant wildlife for sure, but there may have been a lot of extinctions before Europeans got here. And there were very few humans. So that's the pristine myth. For a very long time, the assumption was that there were about 1.5 million native peoples living in harmony with the environment at the time of Columbus's arrival. And that idea can be traced back historically to pretty much the romantic writers of the 19th century United States. People like James Fenimore Cooper, right? Which was Last of the Mohegans, right? And it's great stuff, but Longfellow, Henry David Thoreau, okay, Francis Parkman, other historians, even artists like George Catlin. George Catlin, is considered to be one of the better artists who depicted native peoples in the Great Plains in a very humane and accurate way. But even by doing that, he really shaped a lot of the perceptions of native peoples. It would be like Frederick Remington and others who would, portray native peoples in a very negative way, as a sort of an enemy from nature, in a way. Anyway, so let's look at some other evidence here. The population in the Americas at 1492 the estimates began to rise after World War II. But even by about 1940, most of the academic community was only willing to say there was about maybe 8 to 15 million people living in the Americas in 1492. But today, archaeological evidence and other estimates put it somewhere between like 40 and 80 million people on both continents in 1492. So the question is, of course, what happened to them? And there's increasingly a lot of evidence about settlements that existed but are long gone, or were even long gone before permanent European settlement or even exploration. So the idea is that humans have occupied the continent of North America for at least 14,000 years. Populations may have been in the tens of millions. We're not really for sure. But we have some ideas about maybe what happened to those people, right? And that goes back to the smallpox and the measles and the mumps and the chickenpox and rubella and all of those European diseases, or old world diseases. We can't call them European diseases because the Europeans died like flies too. The Europeans had exposure to those, as you mentioned. Europeans had exposure to those old world diseases for thousands of years. And so, over time, natural selection allowed those people who had survived they still got sick, but they didn't necessarily die. In the New World, on the other hand, mortality was much, much higher than what the Europeans were used to. So Europeans Many of them had smallpox scars all over their bodies because they had survived smallpox. Not everybody's survived it. And of course, the average age of a European in 1492 is only like in the 30s. So primarily because of high infant mortalities. But if you can survive to like 5 years old, you're doing pretty good. You have a pretty good chance to survive to adulthood and maybe even into old age if you get into your 40s or 50s or something like that if you're lucky. But anyway, the idea here is that Native peoples were exposed to an exchange of biological organisms, both good and bad, after 1492. It's a term that was popularized by a historian at the University of Texas by the name of Alfred Crosby in a book called, what, anybody know? The Columbian Exchange, okay? The Columbian Exchange. The idea that in 1492 and after 1492, old world organisms, here's the old world over here on your left, or on your right, okay? Old world organisms, both diseases, but also human populations, livestock, and crops, all of those began to diffuse and spread to the New World. Likewise, New World crops especially began to be taken back to the Old World. So they started growing corn in Europe, or maize, okay? And they started producing potatoes in Europe, and tomatoes, and peanuts, and lots and lots of other things, okay? Peppers. They all come from the New World, okay? The Mesoamerican agriculturalists that got started only about 2,000, maybe 1,500 years ago, had developed a huge array of agricultural crops that totally transformed the diets of the rest of the world once they were taken back after the colonial period, after 1492. What did they get in exchange? They got a lot of old world diseases. Now, there were some diseases, supposedly viral syphilis, supposedly was originated in the New World and went to the Old World, okay? But it was an incredibly different, unbalanced exchange, okay? The cliff notes are, the Old World benefited enormously from the contact with the New World. The New World was decimated by diseases with its contact from the Old World. And the worst part being about a loss of anywhere from 50 to 90% of the population within just a few hundred years, of contact. By the time we get to North America, by the time the Spaniards, like De Soto, are tramping around the South, the lower Mississippi Valley, and enslaving Indians, and trying to find some gold, and spreading smallpox, that's 1540s, okay? That's only a half century after Columbus, right? So a half century after Columbus, the viral and the worst decimating contagious diseases are introduced into North America. Now, as we'll see, the English, really the French too, were slow to get to the New World. The Spanish were early, the Portuguese were pretty early. But the Dutch and the English and the French were pretty slow. In fact, the English were really slow. It's not like the English did not be prompt, right? The English were kind of known for their promptness, being on time, but not in the case of North America. The English arrived late. We'll talk about why as we get on later. The point is that the Spanish arrived, and by the time the English colonized any significant degree of North America, we were in the 17th century, okay? The 17th century, 1600s. So the English started colonizing significantly 100 years after the Spanish introduced diseases into North America. Diseases had been spreading and wiping out populations for a century, no less, a century before the English even made a dent in Virginia or in Massachusetts. This means that nobody really ever knew how many people lived in North America. Even DeSoto, who was actively looking, and other people like Coronado, remember we talked about Coronado. Coronado went up to the plains. Why was Coronado going up north? Remember that?
The 7 cities.
Yeah, he's looking for gold. He's looking for gold. The Spanish. Okay, let's talk a little bit about luck. All right, you've probably heard of the luck of Cortez, right? Hernando Cortez, conqueror of the Aztec Empire, arrives in 1517. Just happens to be the year that the Mesoamerican spiritual calendar, which was operating on a 52-year cycle, just happened to be the year that the Aztecs were expecting the god, what? Quetzalcoatl. They were expecting Quetzalcoatl to arrive. It was sort of like, you're too young to know this, but about the time you were born, there was this thing called Y2K. And everybody was freaking out because, oh gosh, the world's going to end. The elevator's going to stop, and the street lights are going to go berserk.
You got to tell them why, though.
Yeah, because of a computer glitch or some kind of programming glitch. I can't remember. But everybody was like up in arms about, oh no, we don't know what's going to happen in 2000, but we're expecting something awful to happen because of the computers and the way things work. Because it was like everything went to 1999, I guess, right? Isn't that what it was? 1999. And then in 2000, nobody knew what was going to happen. So it was kind of like that, except for the Aztecs, it was a little different. The Aztecs took it a little bit more seriously. The Aztecs were expecting Quetzalcoatl, the bird snake god, to come back, and the world was going to end. If the world was not, to save the world, you had to sacrifice human lives. You had to get blood on, on the pyramid, on the temple, and they were working their way up, sacrificing people day and night to prepare for the arrival of Quetzalcoatl. Now, of course, they sacrificed all of those people who they had conquered. Okay, so as a tax, they brought in, Vestal virgins and young children, and they put them up on the altar, and they cut their chests open and removed their heart while it was still beating. That was the requirement, and dropped their bodies. That was the sacrifice to the sun god. They were doing that like crazy. The people the Aztecs had conquered didn't like the Aztecs at all. Cortez arrives in 1517. Now, the prophecy about Quetzalcoatl was that he would arrive. There would be coming from the ocean. They would be on beasts that no one had ever seen before. Horses. Okay, nobody had ever seen horses before, and certainly not big Spanish cavalry horses. And there were a number of other lucky occurrences. Primarily that Cortez landed in territory where everybody absolutely despised the Aztecs and were ready to do the very first thing to overthrow them. So Cortez arrives to people who are embracing him because he has the potential to liberate them. Now, if you like that story, you need to take a class from Dr. Michael Smith in the history department. He teaches a great Latin American history, and he'll tell the story much better than I could ever do. But the idea here is that Cortez got really darn lucky, and another thing that he got lucky with was that somebody had smallpox on the boat, a slave, and smallpox ran rampant ahead of his small conquering group of conquistadors and wound up annihilating the military power of the Aztecs. So he was able to fool the Aztec Montezuma. You know, he took Montezuma hostage and wound up overthrowing this huge empire in a matter of months with a tiny group of people who thought they were gods. Anyway, the luck of Cortez, all right? Spanish got lucky. Now, a lot of others didn't get lucky. One of the reasons, the primary reason that English were so late in getting to North America was precisely the Spanish. The English and the Spanish were rivals. They were enemies. But the Spanish were much more powerful, right? And you all know this story. When did everything change for the English? What year? It's easy to remember. What's the most important political date in the English calendar? Well, in my opinion, 1688, right? The Glorious Revolution. The date in which the English government began to deny the concept of the divine right of kings. And they became a democracy, a parliamentary democracy, essentially. 1688, Glorious Revolution. 100 years before that, exactly, 1588, what happened? The demise of the Spanish Armada. And you probably know the story, but the Spanish had these huge, massive ships, big, powerful ships. And the English had smaller, faster, more maneuverable ships. The Spanish were, planning on this invasion, and England, again, got really lucky in the sense that the Spanish Armada wound up going a little farther north than they really needed to, and they got hit with a nor'easter, massive storm that more or less decimated the entire Spanish Navy, Spanish Armada. They were going. It was sort of like D-Day, except the hurricane hit the ships on D-Day and wiped out D-Day. Can you imagine that? So essentially, you have the Spanish Armada being wiped out, and suddenly England is a naval power. And so England, after 1588, begins to pick at the Spanish Empire in the Americas. We talked a little bit about the Gulf Stream and the movement of the Spanish galleons, those big, heavy Spanish galleons laden with gold and silver and everything that they had looted from the Indians in Peru and in Mexico. That was just a gravy train of gold going back to Europe. By the way, causing all sorts of inflation in Europe and screwing up the Spanish economy big time, of which the Dutch and later the English would take major advantage of because they were Protestants and they were business people and they believed in interest. They didn't have the usury issue that the Roman Catholics did. Going back though, the English began to pick at. What do I mean by pick at the Spanish? If you're a Monty Python fan, there are just 1,000 jokes on this one. The Spanish versus the English back in the Middle Ages. But the Spanish galleons, were moving gold, and the English began to raid those Spanish gold shipments. And this was during the period of, sir.
Were those the privateers or?
Exactly, that's what I'm trying to get at. Thanks very much. You're speeding me up, that's good.
Sorry about that.
No, that's cool. I'm glad you're there. Tell us about the privateer. What's the difference between a privateer and a pirate?
Weren't they sponsored by the government?
They had
They affiliated with their sponsor?
yeah, not so much sponsored, but
They had a
hoodwinked. There you go. It's okay. And Queen Elizabeth, of course, was the one who said this. Now, Elizabeth, used the excuse, well, they're Catholics, they're our arch enemies, and the agreement was that people like Sir Francis Drake and others. Here are some other famous privateers. Anyway, those were the fellows who were essentially running a business on capturing what the Spanish had stolen from the Indians. Okay, so their booty. Okay, their booty. That's a great term, isn't it? In the technical sense, the booty. Okay, the booty was coming to Spain, and the English had a what we would call a green light from the authorities to go after it. You know, kind of like I don't know if this. I don't think this is still going on. I think they changed the laws a little bit, but you know, back 15 years ago or so, you know, during the part of the drug wars, you know, the local police departments, maybe they still do this, I don't know. Local police departments said, okay, if you make a drug arrest, right, you find drugs in a car, then you get to, they impound the car, and then the police department, you know, gets to sell the car at auction, and the city gets to, whatever it is, they sell the car at auction. This is how they funded a lot of, you know, a lot of equipment and that sort of things. They would make these drug raids, the cash and all of the, you know, cars and all the property and stuff would get seized, and that would go into building up the police power. Not that I really have much against that. I think the drug dealers ought to lose all their money. But anyway, the idea was that the privateers would raid the Spaniards, and then they would give a cut to the Queen, right, as just loyal subjects. But they weren't considered criminals. So it was kind of like a proxy war in a sense. Okay, I can talk more about New World population at length, and I've already talked about the DeSoto expedition that was in the South, in the U.S. South between about 1539 and 1543. One of the things that the DeSoto expedition may have done, we're not really sure about this, but how many of you have ever been to Heavener, Oklahoma? I think we talked about Heavener already with the runestone, but there's something even more interesting in Heavener, or near Heavener. It's actually near Spiro. You know Spiro? Okay, Spiro Mounds. There's a Mississippian archaeological site in eastern Oklahoma, and part of this Mississippian culture. And the Mississippian culture is very similar in artwork and everything else that we have artifact-wise to the Mesoamerican cultures, the Aztecs and the Mayans, real similar to the Mayan stuff. So the assumption is that the Mississippian culture had been sort of an offshoot of diffusion of culture up from Mexico. And it got, it was flourishing right about the time, maybe 1200, the year 1200 AD, 1300 AD. And it may have gone into decline before that, kind of like this projector goes into decline every now and then. It was perhaps going into decline, but then when DeSoto arrived, he may have completely extinguished this civilization, perhaps causing all kinds of population loss due to the expansion of viral diseases. But the cultures that emerged out of the breakup of what we think was a Mississippian culture, a fairly highly developed agricultural society, or civilization. Once that broke up in the 1500s, maybe a little earlier, then the groups that reformed became known as the Southeastern Indians, or the Southern Indians, or the Muskogean-speaking peoples for the most part. So the Choctaw and Chickasaw and Creek, Seminole, the Homa, the various Caddoan groups, different linguistic stock, the Southeastern Indians, the Catawbas, Tuscarora, the numerous others, Tuscaroras. A lot of those Southeastern groups had very similar cultural traits by the time English and Spanish and French traders made permanent contact with them. And the idea is that they were kind of the cultural descendants or the heirs to that earlier Mississippian culture. Any of y'all ever heard of that story? You've heard that? Okay, good. So the Mississippian, is pretty much the predecessor, supposedly, of the groups like the Choctaws and the Creeks. Okay, I'm going to leave you with this awful hand-drawn graph. And I'm just going to give you some examples because we have been talking about the Spanish a lot. The island of Hispaniola, all right, in 1492 is estimated to have an indigenous population of about 1 million people. 1 million people. By 1542, the native population had gone to 300 people. Okay? That's a lot of loss. The Arawak Indians and the Carib Indians, if you've ever heard of the Caribbean, all right? The Carib Indians were a number of different groups, actually, but those were just the linguistic stocks. Largely decimated, wiped out, because they were living on islands, and islands were very, very quick to lose populations because people couldn't go anywhere. Think about how that would be different in North America. In the case of North America, you had these population decimations, right? These massive wipeouts, but then peoples that like the Mississippian peoples that became the Choctaws and the Creeks, people would migrate. Just as Mr. Smith said earlier here, people migrated to get away from awful things. The peoples who were most resistant to the expansion of European or Old World diseases were the migratory, the least sedentary people, the nomadic peoples, mostly of the prairies and of the plains. There weren't a huge number of people on the Great Plains yet in 1500. But by 1600, it was becoming pretty clear that the most sedentary populations in the Southwest and in the Southeast were getting wiped out, and the less sedentary groups were surviving more. And in particular, the semi-nomadic peoples of the plains and the prairies were not entirely affected by these diseases. So that's probably enough. And anyway, this is the estimated population crash. Okay, so from 1492, perhaps as many as 80 million people. Quick decimation over just a century, a stability period, and then as the European population arrives in the early 17th century, the European population would not climb very rapidly until after the American Revolution. So here you're looking at, for the most part, an English, Dutch, French population, and in Spanish. We're in the Southwest, but not too many. And as that population would grow, the American Indian population would pretty much level out. By the end of the 19th century, it would go to the very lowest of Native American population. However, the 20th century was a rebound period. And the 20th century has seen a great increase in the number and even the proportions of American Indian populations in North America. So that's enough. And I don't know if I'll continue this on later, but you might get to see more of it later. Let's try to go for reading about the French. I've given you some readings. Read about the French for Tuesday. And if you even have time, go to YouTube and check out, what's it called? Black Road. Black Road. Have a good weekend.